began as a dinner table conversation with my grandpa. It was right before I was heading off to college, so my grandpa had a bit of advice, some information that he wanted to tell me before I take the next step in my life. So naturally, I was very interested in listening to what he had to say, because this is a man that never was born with civil rights. This is a man that never had a chance to go to college. So I was very interested in listening to his story. He told me a story about a Native American man who lived on a reservation in Oklahoma. Now, this Native American man felt as if it was his duty and his mission to teach other Native Americans. He felt like education would be the great escape for them to get outside the reservation. Now, as townspeople would always say, it's not right for you to do that. You know a little too much, you grasp a little too much, and someone, somewhere, will do something about it. But this man would go about his day just like any other. Until one day, well, he didn't come home. And his wife and his 8 kids sat at the door, waiting and waiting and waiting. And later on that night, there was a knock on the door by a neighbor who said, "Your husband was dragged outside of the schoolroom, tied to some railroad tracks, and ran over and killed." My grandpa leaned over and he said, "That story of that Native American man, that's the story of my dad. And that's the story of your great-grandpa." And he asked me to never forget this story. One thing that I'll never forget is the kind of pain on his face. It's the kind of pain that you see in so much injustices that all Native Americans have seen. Today, let's visit the cause behind all Native American pains. Let's figure out who caused it, which is of course our American government. And finally, let's make sure that our American government lives up to the United States Constitution. No ifs, no ands, and no buts. Now, imagine, if you will, if all of us today decided to create a government organization in Washington, D.C., let's say housed through the Department of Defense. And its whole goal is to kill off all blacks, all women, and all LGBT. Even if we thought this was a good idea, I know that the American people wouldn't vote for this. I know that the American people would rise up in arms and say, this is a contradiction to our United States Constitution. Well, I'm from D.C., and there's a building there that's a contradiction to our United States Constitution. It's called the Bureau of Indian Affairs. Now, its very own Secretary Kevin Grover, states that that was its exact mission, to kill off every Native American. And that building still exists in Washington, D.C. Now, I decided to take a look at some of the research on the Library of Congress's database, A Century of Lawmaking and Congressional Documents, and I saw 263 treaties broken. I saw a list of the heinous crimes that have been committed against Native Americans. Just to highlight a few, if you all think that bioterrorism is bad, well, we are its creators. When the Founding Fathers came to America, one of them was Lord Amherst, and his goal was to kill off all Native Americans. And he said the best way to do this was to provide them with gifts of blankets, and those blankets would have smallpox or cholera. You fast forward a little bit more through the database and you'll see the Trail of Tears, where they try to remove all the Native Americans from their location, which was simply a death march because 1/3 of Native Americans were killed during this time period. And finally, you fast forward once again and you'll see that our American government has caused environmental racism, where they place high levels of nuclear waste right on Native American reservations. It's at this point, whenever I tell people all the ills that our American government has caused to Native Americans, that I hear people say, that happened in the past. It's time to move on, and the ills and the injustices aren't happening today. But today I'm going to share some facts with you that show you just exactly how the Native Americans have not had a happy ending. Now, the Bureau of Indian Affairs, which I just mentioned, has been tasked today with holding $450 million of Native American funds. And $250 million go through that office every single year. This is trust funds, this is money that keeps Native Americans from being a part of subsistence living. And that's money that's been stolen. Now, when the Native Americans realized that all of this money has been stolen, well, they believed in our American government. And they decided to file a class action lawsuit. And this lawsuit was known as Coble versus Salazar. It took 13 years for this to be heard, and in 2002, it finally saw the light of day. And according to CBS News during this time period, our own Department of Interior was held in contempt for destroying all files that said the money was stolen from Native Americans. Now, the final factor in deciding this case, they decided that the best way to solve this issue was to give Native Americans $1.4 billion and put it in an accounting trust fund. Put $2 billion in a land trust fund and give Native Americans $60 million and place that in an Indian scholarship fund. Now, they said the only way to get this solved, we're almost through it all, is to make sure that our Congress signs off and then we can give the Native Americans the money. But once it hit Congress's desk, well, a contradiction happened. Our very own presidential candidate, John McCain, was tasked with taking a look at this information. And when he did, he said that the theft of Native Americans is horrible, but the thought of actually having the American public having to pay for it, well, that's far too difficult. I guess when we talk about liberty and justice for all, well, we're not including the Native Americans. It's disappointing because our American government knows the problem, they identify the problem, but they're not doing anything about it. There's another building in Washington, D.C., and it's known as the Holocaust Museum. It's a study and an image and a reminder to all of the American public of what a government can do to innocent people. Just this past week, the names were read from the Holocaust Museum of all the people that died, all the innocent men, women, and children. In a nation far away across the land, if they decided to create a museum about the American government and about how they treated Native Americans, how would they portray us? How many days would it take for them to read off the names of innocent men, women, and children that were Native Americans? And how many names would it take to say how many people had their money stolen by our very own American government? What would they tell us? They'd say, there's still time. There's still time to solve this issue. And they'd say, our American government can't solve it, but they'd say our very own ICJ, the International Court of Justice, can. By bringing a panel of nations and bringing a panel of third world countries also, bringing them together, talking about the issue, and based upon what they decide, that's what our American government will do. And also included in that, because it took so long for this issue to be solved, well, the American government will have to pay interest. Now, I know some people might say that the Native Americans, if they take a look at the U.S. Census's website, only make up 2% of America. And they're uneducated, and most of them are old, so they're going to die off anyway. But my question is, who put them there? My question is, if we have a chance to bail out the banks, if we have a chance to bail out the auto industry, why don't we have a chance to help the Native Americans? I want to thank you so much for listening to my story and this story of the Native Americans and the pain that's behind their faces. I stand proudly before you as an African American, as an Irish American, as an Asian American, and as a Native American. For all of the other races, there has been a judgment day. There has been a sense of solvency. But unfortunately, even today, there hasn't been a sense of solvency for the Native Americans. Thank you once again. Today you heard about the pain behind the Native Americans. You learned who caused it, and you also learned a sense of solvency. It's time for our American government not to contradict our Constitution. No ifs, no ands, and no buts. Thank you.